Welcome back to Inclusion Revolution here on Eastlink TV. I am still your host, Tova Sherman, and Emma Halpern and I are just going to wrap up our discussion over the next few minutes about the very important work that the Nova Scotia Barristers Society is doing through their Employment Equity Office to include persons with disabilities and to ensure that really the legal community is representative of that community as well. So Emma, before we broke, we were talking about this really, I've read it, so I'm aware of your accommodation policy, and I think it's very, very important. I wanted to take this opportunity to not only invite our viewers, if they have any questions or concerns or even ideas around the importance of that accommodation policy, feel free to write us at info@inclusionrevolution.com, and we will be sure that Emma gets any of your questions or concerns. But I also recommend that you, our viewer, check out the Nova Scotia Barristers Society website, which is www.nsbs.org, and check out also the Society Record, which is their magazine, and it's got some wonderful information about what they're up to and some of the things that they're focused on, and that'll give you a better sense of the Barrister Society if you're interested. But Emma, we've talked about the accommodation policy a little, and again, I'm also hoping that if there's any legal members of the legal community listening, they're going to call you up and say, hey, we'd like to see that policy, and perhaps be one of the really early on board, and I think one of the pioneers in taking on this policy. And I'm certainly hoping that anyone listening from any of the firms in the community reaches out to you about that.
That'd be great.
Other than the accommodation policy, can we talk a little bit about what else is happening in this sort of year coming up where you're trying to put a little bit of a focus on the disability issues?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things I should say at the outfront is this is somewhat new for us. We haven't really done a lot of focus around disability or mental health, and but it is a priority. And so my real interest is to reach out as much as I can to a variety of different community groups as well as members of the public and hear from them and hear about people's experiences accessing the justice system. This year also, of course, well, the next 3 years there is a focus at the Barristers Society on access to justice, and we are extremely concerned about access to justice in Nova Scotia. And of course, persons living with disabilities do have very unique and specific concerns relating to access to justice. And so the goal will be to sort of make sure that as we look at disability and as we look at mental health, that we ensure that we are looking at that under the lens of access to justice. Through that committee that I spoke of earlier, I think one of the things we've sort of as a next step is to start putting together where are the, as I said before, I think too, the sort of pressure points. If we only have a small amount of time, where should we be focusing our time, our efforts as we move forward on this initiative?
Right. Well, I know from my experiences and hearing from a number of clients over the last 10 years that Reachability has had its legal services, one of the things that I often hear is I didn't understand, or the method of communication. Now, we talked a little bit that I'm going to have an opportunity to do some of that training, which is really important, I think, and one of those gaps that we need to sort of fill in. And there is that perception that, much like the prescription pad of a doctor, a lawyer is speaking his own language, and a lot of the clients that I speak to are frustrated not necessarily from the information, because it's always quite accurate and probably quite specific, but in the delivery of it, in the perhaps the lack of patience, or in the use of the certain words that are just, you know, a little too legalese for any of us. I sometimes feel myself when speaking with a lawyer a little over, and the intimidation factor, I'm not going to lie. There's so much control for the client, the need for that lawyer to help them, that oftentimes there's a lot of sure, but not really getting it. And I wondered if this committee is going to be looking at that, or perhaps has some directions in which they'd like to take in addressing that issue, because I believe it to be one of the biggest issues and the biggest stigmas for persons with disabilities when going to lawyers is they don't want to disclose because they're afraid of perhaps the lawyer even being tougher on them. And there's just such a cycle going on there, and I wonder if there's any ideas or any work going on in the committee around that.
Certainly, and I mean, I agree with you. Communication is a big issue across the board for anyone from the public who's going to access lawyers. And I do know that, you know, even at the level of law school, there is a move towards more plain language, even within, you know, and there's a number of things, whether it's going and talking to your lawyer or being able to have access to plain language versions of legislation. And I mean, this is sort of outside the scope of what we're talking about to some degree, but we're seeing more and more self-represented litigants.
Absolutely.
And there you go, that's sort of legalese sounding, but more and more individuals going and representing themselves in in court.
Right. Well, actually, here's where you and I disagree. I know that the legal term is self-represented. I call it non-represented.
Yeah.
Because from my perspective, to go in there and have someone else have a lawyer, or perhaps, the lawyer of whoever you're with, and you being on your own, I perceive it, of course, as being non-represented, and I think a lot of the community does. And although the concept of self-representation sounds possible, I'm not sure with the complexities of where the legal law, well, basically the laws have gone, make it even really realistic for someone to self-identify. But I know that to self-represent. But I know that that's basically an issue we could spend an entire show on, and I won't go there because I know our time is really limited. But what I did want to know is, if, as we wrap up for today, if there's anything most important that you'd like that our community to know about the work that you're doing, because I do think it's really important, and I am very grateful for your commitment to the community as a whole.
Yes, and I think the number one thing I'd like to say on that is just this is the beginning of this work for me and for the Equity Office. So we're just starting. We're starting with things like an accommodation policy, with trying to listen and talk to community members, with forming committees that will have the mandate to focus on these particular issues of persons living with disabilities and their interaction with the legal profession. And we're looking at representation and diversity within the legal profession itself, and making sure that we see more people living with disability who are working in law firms, who are working in...
So what I'm really hearing from you is give you a little time. We'll have you on later, and we'll find out what else you've been up to.
Yeah.
Because really that's what's exciting, and we have lots more to talk about, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I just wanted to let everyone know that our poll question today is really about the legal community, and asking, why don't you do the question today? The poll question. Come on.